Welcome back everyone to our reading of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, and at the end of chapter 15 we got up to the part where Lucy and Susan have ridden on the back of Aslan, and now they're in the witch's courtyard and they're amongst a whole lot of stone statues. And chapter 16 part 1 is called What Happened About the Statues. "What an extraordinary place," cried Lucy. "All those stone animals, and people too. It's like a museum." "Hush," said Susan. "Aslan's doing something." He was indeed. He had bounded up to the stone lion and breathed on him. Then, without waiting a moment, he whisked around, almost as if he had been a cat chasing its tail, and breathed also on the stone dwarf, which, as you remember, was standing a few feet from the lion with its back to it. Then he pounced on a tall stone dryad, which stood beyond the dwarf, turned rapidly aside to deal with the stone rabbit on his right, and rushed on to two centaurs. But at that moment Lucy said, "Oh, Susan, look at the lion." I expect you've seen someone put a lighted match to a bit of newspaper which is propped up in a fire, and for a second nothing seems to have happened, and then you notice a tiny streak of flame creeping along the edge of the newspaper. It was like that now. For a second after Aslan had breathed upon him, the stone lion looked just the same. Then a tiny streak of gold began to run along his white marble back, and then it spread. Then the colour seemed to lick all over him as the flame licks all over a bit of paper. Then, while its hindquarters were still obviously stone, the lion shook his mane, and all the heavy stone folds rippled into living hair. Then he opened a great red mouth, warm and living, and gave a big yawn. And now his hind legs had come to life. He lifted one of them and scratched himself. And then, having caught sight of Aslan, he went bounding after him and frisked around him, whimpering with delight and jumping up to lick his face. Of course, the children's eyes turned to follow the lion, but the sight they saw was so wonderful that they soon forgot about him. Everywhere the statues were coming to life. The courtyard looked no longer like a museum, it looked more like a zoo. Creatures were running after Aslan and dancing around him till he was almost hidden in the crowd. Instead of all that deadly white, the courtyard was now a blaze of colours: glossy chestnut sides of centaurs, indigo horns of unicorns, dazzling plumage of birds, reddy brown of foxes, dogs and satyrs, yellow stockings and crimson hoods of dwarves, and the birch girls in silver, and the beech girls in fresh transparent green, and the larch girls in green so bright that it was almost yellow. And instead of the deadly silence, the whole place rang with the sound of happy roarings, brayings, yelpings, barkings, squealings, cooings, neighings, stampings, shouts, hoorays, songs, and laughter. "Oh," said Susan in a different tone, "look, is it safe?" Lucy looked and saw that Aslan had just breathed on the feet of the stone giant. "It's all right," shouted Aslan joyously. "Once the feet are put right, all the rest of him will follow." "That wasn't exactly what I meant," whispered Susan to Lucy, but it was too late to do anything about it now, even if Aslan would have listened to her. The change was already creeping up the giant's legs. Now he was moving his feet. A moment later he lifted his club off his shoulder, rubbed his eyes and said, "Bless me, I must have been asleep. Now, where's that dratted little witch that was running about on the ground? Somewhere just by my feet it was." But when everyone had shouted up to him to explain what had really happened, and when the giant had put his hand to his ear and got them to repeat it all again, so that at last he understood, then he bowed down till his head was no further off than the top of a haystack, and touched his cap repeatedly to Aslan. There's a picture of all the animals and the giant coming back to life. Beaming all over his honest, ugly face. Giants of any sort are now so rare in England, and so few giants are good-tempered, that 10 to 1 you have never seen a giant when his face is beaming. It's a sight well worth looking at. Now for the inside of this house, said Aslan. Look alive, everyone, upstairs and downstairs and in my lady's chamber. Leave no corner unsearched. You never know where some poor prisoner may be concealed. And into the interior they all rushed, and for several minutes the whole of that dark, horrible, fusty old castle echoed with the opening of windows and with everyone's voices crying out at once, "Don't forget the dungeons! Give us a hand with this door! Here's another little winding stair! Oh, I say, here's a poor kangaroo! Call Aslan! Phew! How it smells in here! Look out for trapdoors up here! There are a whole lot more on the landing!" But the best of all was when Lucy came rushing upstairs shouting out, "Aslan, Aslan, I've found Mr. Tumnus! Oh, do come quick!" A moment later Lucy and the little fawn were holding each other by both hands and dancing around and round for joy. The little chap was none the worse for having been a statue, and was of course very interested in all she had to tell him. But at last the ransacking of the witch's fortress was ended. The whole castle stood empty, with every door and window open, and the light and the sweet spring air flooding into all the dark and evil places which needed them so badly. The whole crowd of liberated statues surged back into the courtyard, and it was then that someone, Tumnus I think, first said, "But how are we going to get out?" For Aslan had got in by a jump, and the gates were still locked. "That'll be all right," said Aslan, and then, raising on his hind legs, he bawled out to the giant. "Hi, you up there," he roared. "What's your name?" "Giant Rumblebuffin, if it pleases your honour," said the giant, once more touching his cap. "Well then, Giant Rufflebuffin," said Aslan, "just let us out of this, will you?" "Certainly, your honour, it will be my pleasure," said Giant Rumblebuffin. "Stand well away from the gates, all you little uns." And then he strode to the gate himself, and bang, bang, bang went his huge club. The gates creaked at the first blow, cracked at the second, and shivered at the third. Then he tackled the towers on each side of them, and after a few minutes of crashing and thudding, both the towers and a good bit of the wall on each side went thundering down in a mass of hopeless rubble. And when the dust cleared, it was odd, standing in that dry, grim, stony yard, to see through the gap all the grass, and waving trees, and sparkling streams of the forest, and the blue hills, and beyond that, and beyond them, the sky.